Same day, same time, different speaker, different topic. I welcome you all to the 39th seminar of the International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress Seminar Series, Phase 3, that I organize in my capacity as the founder of the Global South Network. I'm Dr. Nauman Reayat. I'm a lecturer in law at the Leicester Law School, and I will chair today's session. I'm joined by Dr. Prout, who is a reader in Hispanic Studies, School of Modern Languages, Cardiff University. He's a discussant for today's session. Ryan's research centers on the literary and visual cultures of Spain, Cuba, and Mexico. He studies comics, films, and literary texts with a focus on what they tell us about disability, questions of LGBT plus experience and gender, ethology, and marginalization. I'm also joined by Sebastian Bustamante-Brauning, who is a Southwest and Wales doctoral training partnership PhD candidate at the Department of Hispanic, Spanish, and Latin American Studies, University of Bristol and the University of Exeter. Sebastian recently worked as the assistant director of the Essex Collection of Art from Latin America, where he taught, researched, and lectured on art, politics, and the history of Latin America. In this role, he also curated displays and organized interdisciplinary symposia, events, and learning sessions. Sebastian's research interests include photography, visuology, art, history, digital heritage, human rights, and memory in Latin America, and the interstices between these areas. Last but not the least, our guest speaker for today's session is Isobel Webster, who is a PhD student at the School of Modern Languages, University of Leicester. Isobel is currently researching British Latinx literature in the 21st century. She recently completed an MPhil at Leicester, her thesis exploring the representation of queer Puerto Ricans in documentary film. Her research interests include Latin American and Latinx visual and literary cultures, particularly looking at the intersections with gender studies, queer studies, and disability studies. Today, Isobel will present their project titled Frustration and Liberation, Linguistic Identity in British Latinx Literature. Isobel, you have 30 to 35 minutes for the presentation, which will be followed by 7 minutes for comments, questions of discussant and peer commentator, and 15 minutes of question and answer session by attendees. The floor is now yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to everyone for coming, and Norman, thank you for having me. I wanted to start the presentation by kind of going through briefly what the outline of the presentation will be. So part one will look at the broader PhD project. I should at this point say first year, so it's still a work in progress, but yeah. And then in the second part, I will kind of hone in on the theme of linguistic identity, looking to those ideas of kind of whether it's a source of frustration or an opportunity to kind of feel liberated. So starting with the aims of the project, broadly speaking, the project has two aims. So the first being surveying what British Latinx literature exists, kind of creating a corpus, mapping in that sense. And then the second being analysing, exploring that literature, looking at what the influences of that literature are, what factors have shaped it, and what it might tell us about British Latinx identity. So a little bit of background of the project to contextualise. Latinx studies is still a relatively new field. It emerged from discussions in Puerto Rican studies and Chicano studies in the USA in the 60s and the 70s. Since then, it is a fast-growing field, although arguably it is still understudied. The focus within Latinx studies is very much the USA. There's lots of centres for Latinx studies in the USA. However, Isobel Velázquez has begun to advocate for the field to expand, to explore Latinidades outside of the USA. And he, in 2019, wrote a paper looking at the experiences of Latinos in China, Spain, and Jordan, I think. So yeah, kind of looking to Latinx experiences beyond a USA context. There is also a body of work which maps Latinx experiences in other countries. That work mostly addresses Canada, Australia, and there's a little bit on New Zealand as well. In terms of then British Latinx studies and research into British Latinidad, the first text that arguably contributed towards that was Decho and Diamond in 1998 in a text which looked at famous Latin Americans who had lived in London and kind of contributed to London. Since then, arguably the most significant piece has been a project by McIlwain et al. Called No Longer Invisible, which sought to map the British Latinx population, kind of estimate the size of the population, and look at some of the kind of geographical and political factors shaping British Latinx life, particularly kind of with a focus on London. And this work actually had a huge part in visibilization and increasing the visibility of British Latinx studies. Then in 2020, Roman Velázquez was the first to explore cultural productions by British Latinos with a study which focused on media. So overall, we can see that the field is of socio-political importance. That's the field of British Latinx studies specifically. So there's socio-political importance there, but there is still a huge gap in terms of looking at cultural productions by British Latinos, mapping those, analysing those, and that's what this project seeks to address, mainly through looking at literature. So briefly, kind of to look at the structure of the paper, there are 3 parts. Part 1, reflecting on the past, part 2, belonging in the present, and part 3, looking to the future. And I'm going to kind of go through those chapters now to kind of provide insight into roughly what the project will entail, what the project will be about. So chapter 1 is called Tracing Roots. This chapter explores representations of national, ethnic, and racial identities. As you can see there's 4 different texts which this chapter analyses, and these texts feature representations of Peru, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico, respectively. So the chapter's going to look at how each of these nations and their nationhoods are presented, and we'll discuss what it means to belong to a country and a culture, and how racial and ethnic identities are experienced, expressed, both in Latin American contexts and in the UK. And of course, a really important part of that is going to be exploring representations of Indigenous identities and experiences as well. Chapter 2, Remembering Chile. So within Latin American literature, memory is often a really prominent issue. So this chapter seeks to explore how that's shaped British Latinx literature. So it sort of focuses on memory, nostalgia, different ways of looking back, different ways of remembering, processing the past and dealing with the past, and how we might kind of interact with the past. It also kind of looks at themes of distance, both in terms of temporal distance and physical distance. So specifically, this chapter looks at the case of writing from Chilean exiles in Britain, the majority of whom fled during Pinochet's dictatorship. And a large part of that has been anthologizing works from different authors. So there's a list of kind of a few anthologies there that include the work of Chilean exiles. It's also interesting to see that in amongst that list, Consuelo Rivera Fuentes appears quite a lot, and she actually set up a publishing company, and one of the kind of key objectives of that was to provide a platform for Chilean exiles to write, to share their writing. So yeah, that the chapter will explore those themes and looking at how remembering can be a form of togetherness, a form of belonging. So moving on to part 2, chapter 3 looks at family dynamics in British Brazilian writing. So within British Brazilian writing, there is a large emphasis placed on family. And this chapter really seeks to kind of understand why that's the case and how family is represented within British Brazilian writing. It's important to note that my work utilises a queer studies definition of family, so not just looking at biological family, but also non-biological forms of kinship, like chosen family. Another important angle is gender studies, so looking at machismo, marianismo, and how those gender roles might affect how family is kind of understood or experienced. Again, belonging, you might have noticed, is a recurring theme throughout the thesis. So family is an important site of belonging, and also serves to remedy non-belonging. And then in terms of, yes, whilst I've said that looking at chosen family is important, so is biological family, and a really important aspect of that is the idea of legacy. So something this chapter hopes to explore is whether legacy is presented as something positive or negative, and whether there's a choice, or what is it fated, or is it something you can choose not to engage in. Chapter 4 I will gloss over quite quickly because that's the theme of the second half of this presentation. But essentially, linguistic identity is a really important part of Latinx studies. Latinx studies in itself is an inherently multilingual field, and my work looks at how linguistic identity is conveyed in British Latinx poetry, and how it is presented as both a source of frustration and an opportunity for liberation. And yeah, like I said, I'll explore that further in the second half of this presentation. And then moving on to part 3. So the London Dream was an idea put forward by Chris Macmillan in 2020, and this chapter makes the case that whereas in Latinx writing from the USA, there's the idea of the American dream is a very prevalent theme. Within British Latinx literature, the equivalent would be this idea of the London dream. So I'm going to explore representations of London within Liébois' poetry, making some comparisons with Juan Toledo's Londres and Eduardo Embry's Talca, Paris and London. I'll be seeking to explore expectations versus reality of London and the London Dream, and then looking to the relationship between urbanity and identity, and kind of the role that cityscapes might play in individualism, individual identity, and how belonging and identity is negotiated and navigated within cityscapes, and how those ideas kind of relate to the notion of like the future. And then chapter 6, British Latinx futurisms. So futurism originated in Italy, and initially it was a cultural movement which had various objectives, including glorifying war, celebrating violence, but also kind of celebrating industrial revolution, so looking at kind of speed, machinery, industry, and it was also quite a disruptive movement as well. However, since since these origins, futurism has evolved, and a really key part of that evolution has been Afrofuturism, African futurism, Indigenous futurisms, and Chicana futurism. So with this idea that there are new possibilities for futurism, for its objectives, both as a kind of cultural and political practice, this chapter seeks to explore how, if there are new possibilities for futurism, what might a British Latinx futurism look like, emerging from literature. So this is sort of conveyed in various different genres, including sci-fi, dystopia, and magical realism. And the chapter seeks to explore what the objectives of British Latinx futurisms are, and how the idea of the future is kind of envisaged and related to within this literature. So the approaches of this project, as hopefully kind of the overview of the chapters has illustrated, it's a very inherently interdisciplinary project. Of course, post-colonial studies and migration studies are at the centre of that, but alongside that, as I've mentioned, there's queer studies, gender studies, lots of different angles kind of making up this picture of exploring British Latinx literature. Another kind of element to the project is I will, in second year, be conducting interviews with authors. Because it's a relatively underexplored field, the interviews seek to kind of gain a better understanding of what they feel their influences are, how they've come to write, what they've written, that sort of thing, to try and sort of enrich the project that way. Archive work as well will be part of this, and that is to provide the project with vital context, but also to look to better my understanding of, for example, the experiences of Chilean exiles in Britain, where there are some archives that kind of document those experiences. And in terms of how I'm approaching the literature, close textual analysis, of course, is an important part of most projects that deal with literature. I will be looking to what frameworks are used when discussing Latinx literature in a US context, and kind of evaluating whether those frameworks are relevant and or helpful in a British context, some of which will be, others of which might be culturally specific to a USA context. As I've already said, it's a very multilingual project. Some of the writing from the authors is in Spanish, Portuguese, some indigenous languages are included. So it's an inherently multilingual project, both in terms of the material that I'm engaging with and what's being written. And the other thing to add is that my work works from an intersectional understanding of identity. I think it's important not to kind of homogenize approaches or kind of make very kind of generalizations. And I feel that Crenshaw's model of intersectionality is a really important part of that. And then the final part of this part, to look to what I see as a really key achievement of the project so far, is the compiling of the corpus. That has included a lot of research on my part, lots of scouring the internet, Googling, looking to anthologies, looking at publishers' websites, and yeah, I think kind of compiling this corpus has been a really important part in mapping the British Latinx literature that exists. The corpus is, of course, constantly growing and evolving, but I think that's even more enriching for the project. At the moment, the corpus is somewhere between 40 and 50 texts. I apologise for not knowing the exact number, but as I said, it's continuously growing and evolving. Within this corpus, there's a great diversity of identities from authors, so different countries, different generations, and lots of different genres make up the text. So as I've already mentioned, kind of dystopia, sci-fi, magical realism, but also things like horror. There's some life writing, there's some romance, there's lots of different genres. There is a strong prevalence of poetry. I'm not sure why. I'm hoping to be able to answer that by the end of the project, but it is significant to know that there is a prevalence of poetry. And anthology sort of goes hand in hand with that. There's a lot of anthologized poetry as well. I've already kind of touched on the fact that it's a very multilingual corpus, and in terms of publishing and distribution, there are a few texts which are published by larger publishing companies, so I think Penguin has published a few of them, but the majority are published by smaller, more independent publishing companies, and I think there might be one or two texts which are independently self-published as well. So, moving on to part 2, looking specifically at the idea of linguistic identity. Linguistic identity is a really important part of Latinx identity and is a focus within Latinx studies. But as I said, it's a very kind of USA-focused field, and there's no work so far really exploring linguistic identity amongst British Latinos. Some of the work is bilingual, and some of it is Spanglish, so a mixture of English and Spanish. Largely, bilingual writing kind of serves to achieve larger audiences because it can be accessed by both Spanish and English speakers, whereas Spanglish generally is most accessible to people who are bilingual, speaking both Spanish and English. But Spanglish does kind of allow for a level of freedom, of hybridization in writing. Although Spanglish is often criticised, Stavans speaks a lot about how Spanglish is often kind of seen as a bit of a corruption of English. I think he uses the word bastardization to sort of highlight how people kind of see it as an improper way or sort of tainting the language. So the focus of this section is a poem by Catherine Lockton called Mi Lengua. Lockton is an Anglo-Bolivian poet residing in London, and this poem appears in her debut collection Paper Doll, but before that it was featured in an anthology called Un Nuevo Sol. The poem largely looks at language loss, and that's kind of expressed in the poem in a number of ways. So I'm going to share the poem now. So I'm just going to do a little reading and then kind of talk through some of the themes. Mientras comía mi cereal esta mañana, while eating my cereal this morning, se cayó mi lengua en mi plato, se quedó ahí. My tongue fell off into my plate, it stayed there. Nadando en la leche mientras mi mamá me hablaba, swimming in milk while my mum spoke. No he podido decirle que no puedo hablar. I couldn't tell her that I could no longer speak. En ese momento llegué a entender que la vida, in this moment I understood that life, pasa, mientras que nosotras las mujeres planchamos, passes us by while us women iron, the shirts of our men, las camisas de nuestros hombres. So first of all, a note on the title, Mi Lengua could be translated into English as my language, but it's really important to note that in Spanish there's 3 different ways to say language. So you can say lengua, lenguaje, idioma, but Lockton has specifically chosen to use the word lengua because it also refers to the tongue, as in like the physical organ, the tongue, and this metaphor is repeated throughout the poem. So the idea of the tongue falling off is a direct reflection of this idea of language loss, and I think it's really interesting as well that the tongue is swimming in milk, nadando. We might expect a severed tongue to just sort of lie there. But in the poem, it's free, it has agency, it's anthropomorphized. And that speaks to kind of a powerlessness of the poet to stop the language loss. I also kind of want to draw attention to the bilingual structure. Often with bilingual poetry, you might have English on one page, Spanish on the next. But as you can see in this poem, it alternates line by line, Spanish, English, Spanish, English. And a monolingual, if somebody just spoke English, they might not necessarily understand that it is a translation that's kind of integrated, although I would argue that the use of cognates here, which I've kind of highlighted, does kind of hint to the monolingual reader that it is a translation. What is super interesting, though, which Spanish speakers I'm sure will have picked up on, but English, if you only speak English, you might not have got this. The Spanish is actually laced with deliberate errors. So a Spanish speaker would see all of these little red bits. And this inclusion of deliberate errors again highlights language loss, the frustration at losing language, the frustration at not speaking Spanish perfectly, and which kind of reflects the theme of the guilt in the poem, that she can't tell her mum that she can't speak Spanish anymore. She has a sense of shame around that. Yeah, so I think that kind of use of a bilingual form, but with kind of an element that only bilingual Spanish and English speakers would understand, is really interesting. I wanted to then kind of look at some comparisons with some of Lockton's other poems. So in Mi Lengua, we have this imperfectly bilingual kind of structure. And this isn't the only time which Lockton uses this bilingual structure. So in this poem, Plátanos Partidos, Lockton also uses a bilingualness, but rather than switching back one line Spanish, one line English, the poem translates it at a changing pace, with one after another that fall away like dominoes, subida, una novela interminable con episodios uno tras otro que caen como dominos. Is, esta, this life, la vida, reírse. Un loco encarcelado en una caja golpeando las paredes. The world turns itself round like a madman locked up in a box, bashing the walls. As you can see, the back and forth between the two languages really creates a kind of jarring, hectic sensation. And I think that kind of that sensation carries through whether you are monolingual, bilingual, if you speak English and Spanish, or you don't. And the poem itself, although you can't necessarily tell from this small extract, is about a fall, her falling. And I think that the way she's used the two languages really kind of reflects that sense of panic almost. Another poem that I kind of wanted to look at of Lockton's is called Dreams of Falling. So whereas Mi Lengua and Plátanos Partidos are bilingual, and they see Spanish and English as two separate languages which do not mix, Dreams of Falling actually kind of mixes the two languages together. So there's a little extract from the first stanza here. So, my mami wraps me in an aguayo, packs me into its colours as tightly as meat tucked into an empanada. She pulls up her pollera, then throws me from my aunt's 7th floor window. Here, Spanish is used for some culturally specific elements, which maybe don't have exact translations into English, can't be translated into English neatly. So aguayo is a type of shawl that can be seen in the picture on the left here. Empanada, I think maybe more people are aware of what empanadas are, but it's a type of pastry, pasty. And pollera, again in the picture, that's the picture on the right, is a type of dress. So these kind of culturally specific images are associated with that looking back and remembering her childhood. I think it's also very interesting that while in Mi Lengua, she refers to her mother as mama. In Dreams of Falling, when she's looking back at childhood, she refers to her as mammy. Yeah, so finally, to draw some conclusions here, I think what that kind of insight into Lockton's poetry has established is that linguistic identity is both the source of frustration and liberation. So it's frustrating in the sense that language loss, or being an imperfect bilingual, can be a source of great frustration. It can affect how one expresses oneself, how identity is understood and portrayed, and in that sense it is frustrating. There is also a background of kind of prejudice towards bilingualism and Spanglish. Certainly, for example, in this country, in England, Britain, we do hear stories of people kind of being frowned upon for being multilingual, for speaking other languages in public, and that shapes and interacts with this idea of kind of frustration around linguistic identity. That said, linguistic identity is a way of belonging. For example, as I was explaining kind of in the poems, that use of Spanglish means that only certain audiences can fully access those poems, can fully understand them. But in that sense, there is a sense of a kind of a mutual understanding between author and audience, in that there is a connection, a belonging between the author and certain audience members who are bilingual. I think also, as we see in Lockton's work, it allows for a real sort of creative way to use language. It breaks rules, it thinks outside the box, and therefore there's a liberation in that. And yeah, that's everything really. So if we wanted to kind of move to comments, to questions, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Isobel, for such a fantastic presentation. I must say, I mean, I'm from law and no idea about the languages, but the way you presented the contents, it was all those were so engaging that I could get the idea, especially the second part, which is very much relevant. And I tell you, the bigger picture is very much applicable to many other federal countries and these languages, because I also teach the Canadian constitutional law. And all these issues we do discuss with regard to the relationship between the French-speaking Canadians and the English-speaking Canadians. But I will stop myself from making any comments and invite Dr. Ryan Prout, our discussant, to share his comments and raise questions if there is any. Ryan?
So I wanted to start by thanking you, Nauman, for your inviting me to take part in this series, and also to learn about Isobel's work, which is I'm really glad to have had that opportunity. And I'll start by saying that I enjoyed looking at your slides, Isobel, and in the presentation, especially the part where you looked at in detail at the two poems that you presenting as examples of different kinds of interactions between English and Spanish. From the slides, looking at these yesterday, they gave me a good sense of the research questions, the structure of the thesis, and of the literary corpus that forms part of the project, along with the activities that can produce primary sources detailed in the later slides. The inclusion of references gives a persuasive sense of there being a literature that can underpin the argument made for developing the as yet quite limited extension of literary studies of Latinidad to the UK. A further question that occurred to me when looking at the initial slides has to do with numbers. for a wider audience perhaps, if not for a literary critical one, there could be some interest in knowing how many people resident in the UK identify with the Spanish-speaking and Lusophone Americas, and how these figures are evolving over time. And in the presentation, Isobel, you did point to a particular reference from, I think it's from 2016, where somebody's done that, so maybe it'd be also interesting to see what's happened in the intervening 7 or 8 years. Would statistics bear out the perception one might gain in London, for example, that among people who would identify with the Spanish-speaking Americas, there is a large proportion who have come via a previous period of residence in Spain? Similarly, some context for the exodus of Chilean intellectuals, workers and activists would help situate the focalization that follows in later slides on Chilean diaspora and memory. The emphasis that we see on memory and on dreams suggests a connection with English language texts by second-generation writers with Latin heritage, such as Cristina Garcia and her semi-autobiographical novel Dreaming in Cuban. And as I was listening to the presentation, Isobel, this notion of dreaming came up several times, and I'm not quite sure where to put that into this picture, but it seems as if the idea of the oniric is significant in figuring out where one sits between two languages. The outline presents a thought-provoking analogy between the American dream and the London dream. As I thought about this, I was curious about how this would be tested. Would it be through comparison of tropes and metaphors in writing by Latin legacy dreamers in Britain and the UK, and the US, or by collecting oral histories with those from the Spanish-speaking Americas who have resettled in the UK? That question was partly answered in the presentation by the reference to carrying out interviews with some of the writers. The contrast between Spanglish, bilingual and monolingual writing in an adopted language struck me as one with great potential within the framework of this project, always assuming that there's sufficient material in British Spanglish to look at. Stavan's translation of some of Don Quixote into Spanglish wasn't only a tour de force, but also underscores how these different reconciliations with language identity and heritage correspond with different modalities and affect. Spanglish, at least until now, seems to be correlated with humour and perhaps with subalternity, and as you were elaborating in the presentation, Isobel, with notions of incorrectness, if that's even a word, and a kind of and bastardization, as you said, a term used by Stavans. Questions of this sort arise in the English language Cuban writer Carlos Ira's reflection on the Spanish translation of his own captivating autobiographical work, Waiting for Snow in Havana, Confessions of a Cuban Boy. Niño Cubano just wouldn't cut it for Cuban Boy, he says, and between them he and the translator came up with Cubanito. Translating this text, which had been a bestseller in English, was one thing. Finding a publisher for the Spanish version was quite another. And that tells us something that one can't expand on here about how readily voices of Latinidad are received in Spanish or English, depending on where they're from and which historical perspective they project. And I got the sense from the presentation that this question of gatekeepers and of publication is one that's going to be developed perhaps in the project. Lockton's poem and its joining of familial relations and loss of language put me in mind of Ira again. Reflecting on the fact that his mother died just before the translation of Nieve and La Habana was ready, he says, "Las palabras habían sido un gran obstáculo hasta este punto. Mi madre nunca aprendió inglés y jamás pude compartir mis más íntimos pensamientos con ella, al menos con el tipo de precisión que a veces uno necesita." He asks the reader of the Spanish translation to remember that aquí está más de 1 millón de cubanos como yo, cubanos que ya no pensamos en castellano, y que podemos pifiar funestamente, y que somos capaces de llamar una tienda de comestibles una tienda de groserías. Just kind of anglicizing grocery store to tienda de groserías, where groserías in Spanish means something quite different. Isobel's slides indicate some of the orthographic slips in the Spanish part of Lockton's poem. Looking at these alongside Ira's thoughts about the translation of his work, those errors seem telling. They can be read as traces of an exile or a breach between generations and so on. José Donoso very adeptly describes dysphoria through language in El Lugar Sin Límites, which I imagine is being referenced in the book with the title Talca, Paris, Londres, if I'm remembering it correctly. And I wonder if one can take it from this that within the project's exploration of linguistic identity, questions of gender and sexual identity will also figure. The slides made me wonder if there's an inverse of Britain as a reception point for Latinidad, and I suppose there is. There are figures like Leonora Carrington, who was driven away from Britain because of not wanting to live her sex according to the social template of the early 20th century. She lived the greater part of her life bilingually in Mexico, and although she didn't write in Spanish, she painted in a Latin idiom perhaps, with pictures like The Magical World of the Maya from 1963. She was also very prescient in terms of incorporating questions of ecology in her paintings, and perhaps because she was exiled and pretty much ignored, especially by the English-speaking world, until quite recently, that was never taken much note of or acknowledged at the time. Carrington's story is also a reminder of the entanglement of Spaniards in Britain during World War II and the Spanish Civil War, and of Britain's reception of another cohort of Spanish speakers from the peninsula, the context that may complicate further the analogy between American and London dreams. So that's what I had written down after looking at the slides, and I hope I've updated those comments a little bit in light of hearing Isobel's presentation.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ryan, for useful feedback. I think it's a lot to process. Isobel, would you like to respond, or should we go first to Sebastian and respond to comments from both of them together?
I think I'll briefly respond now while it's in my head. I think first of all, thank you, Ryan, for your comments. They're very, very insightful. Lots of food for thought there. I suppose I would say I'm glad that the project is reading well, that you see value in some of the ideas, some of the kind of themes. Yeah, just a few points. You kind of brought up the idea of numbers. That is an important question, and honestly, off the top of my head, I don't know numbers. I understand that Latin Americans are the 8th largest ethnic group in the UK, which might be an interesting figure to consider. But yeah, at the moment, I don't know if there are kind of any current estimates on population size. And I believe that one of the kind of biggest issues with that is a kind of lack of recognition of Latin American identity within the UK. So often kind of it's talked about how if you're given a form to fill out and it might say, are you white British, are you Asian, are you black, whatever, like list of boxes, and often Latin American is very usually left off that list and kind of just consigned to other. So it's very hard to kind of estimate population sizes, but you're absolutely right that it's interesting to kind of think about numbers, population sizes. I think that's all for now. Yeah. And of course, any questions, give me a shout. Yeah.
Thank you, Isobel. Without wasting any time, I would invite Sebastian to share his comments and raise questions if there is any. Sebastian, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nauman. Thank you for the invitation, and to Isobel for a fantastic presentation. I think I'm getting the impression that you're sort of still kind of fairly early on in this process of because you're talking about what you're going to go on to do. And I just think actually you've got such a rich set of thoughts going on about this project that I think, it's got so much huge potential. And I also think that Ryan's comments, I would have really benefited from those sorts of comments at a kind of early stage of my PhD. So I think that's really great. I wanted to reflect a little bit again on this kind of central theme about, thinking about identity in the kind of British context of how Latino or Latinx kind of identity is thought about. And I do wonder, there's this aspect of thinking about the US in the context of these are shared histories in terms of populations that lived in parts of the US that actually were Spanish speaking, and then there's also the kind of question of the borders as well, that kind of, and thinking a bit about your kind of the focus of literature. There's kind of interesting stuff about borders and the US Mexico border, for example. But I wonder, I know this is the kind of major thing, and I think what you're trying to do is sort of defend the use of this term in the British context. But I mean, as someone that also, my parents are of that generation that left Chile following the coup. There has always been this problem of, where we fit into this. And I think you mentioned this thing about the censuses, and, every time I look at a form, I see, white, Black Caribbean, Black African, Asian, mixed, multiple ethnic backgrounds. We've now got, English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish, Gypsy, Irish traveller, but nothing for Latin Americans. So I think that does raise this, again, interesting question about where we really fit in terms of in this country. Now, my sort of question is particularly about this thing about the kind of types of migrant movements that we had to the UK. And I think, I don't want to try and posit that these are kind of like hard distinctions, but I think within the context of the kind of Chilean migration to Britain, it was very much kind of bred from this kind of political upheaval and kind of forced migration as a result of the dictatorship in Chile. And I wonder, reflecting a little bit on this corpus that you're kind of assembling, whether there's kind of perhaps the kind of motivations behind the types of migration, whether it be kind of economic migration or political asylum, and whether you're kind of seeing a distinction in the types of kind of literary outputs that's creating. And I wondered, this question of the London dream, although very evocative, I just wonder if there's this risk also of losing perhaps some, if we're talking about kind of otherizing in terms of where do you fit in census forms, if we're, focusing on the kind of London perspectives of, Latin American identity in the UK, then perhaps these kind of more kind of micro histories of kind of regional histories of Latin American identity could be lost potentially. But and then I wondered also, just to mention whilst I'm thinking about it, is just the work of people. There's some PhD scholars working at the moment on this kind of question of exile in the Chilean context. So Veronica Marquez is someone that's working on interviewing kind of next generation. She's using a kind of critical discourse analysis kind of approach and interviewing next generation exiles and kind of exploring the linguistics, the kind of using this approach. And I just wonder if there's something that could kind of be brought into that, into kind of thinking about this question of literature. And just to kind of finish off, it's this idea of what categories we're using to. I wanted to mention one thing, which is your question about, why are there so many poets in Chile? And anecdotally, Chile is a nation of poets, or people that think of themselves as poets. So, and at any one point, a Chilean will try their hand at poetry. And I don't know whether this has a lot to do with the 2 Nobel Prizes, but this is a kind of a nation that really has engaged with poetry as a form. And so I wanted to mention just one book, which is a Prayer in the National Stadium by Maria Eugenia Bravo Caldera, who was an exile in London, I believe, or in the UK, but published this book of poems of her experience of incarceration in the National Stadium. So just kind of to mention that. And then, and then the question was about whether you're counting these as just like published authors, or perhaps these kind of more, but those boundaries are kind of being dispersed a little bit nowadays with kind of sort of this quotidian kind of literature that's written and published online, for example, and people self-publishing works and that type of thing. So I just wondered how you were thinking about that question a little bit. But yeah, I think it's a really fascinating project. I do wonder, Because I mean, some of the things I was doing with my own PhD work was thinking about these two kind of national contexts and how we do this comparative work, and it can be incredibly tricky at times to do this, especially when we're talking about issues of identity and, you know, our kind of frameworks that we're using to understand this. So that's more of a reflection, but I think it's a really fascinating project. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments. Where to start? I'm very, very conscious, as you said, about there are varying different motivations for migration to the UK, various different paths. You mentioned people going via Spain. I'm also conscious of people going via the US to England as well. That's another kind of thing that's appeared. So I think I'm sort of throughout the project trying to acknowledge those different routes, those different experiences, and certainly some discourse, although I think with the bounds of the project I don't have lots of space to do it in depth, but certainly that will be a vital context which certainly makes the introduction and will sort of be laced throughout the project. As you said, I mean, like I think the reason I've dedicated a chapter to Chilean exiles is because I do think it's sort of a not fully unique, because there are other political exiles from Latin America, but certainly the fact that lots of Chilean exiles have come to the UK specifically, and lots of them have written things. I figured it was important to kind of acknowledge that quite specific context. Looking to the London Dream again, there are different experiences kind of encapsulated within that, within this kind of idea of dreaming. I think that there is a lot of the British Latinx literature I've read. There are lots of references to London, and I think again I thought it was kind of important to acknowledge and explore that. I'm conscious, of course, not all British Latinx, not all British Latinos end up in London. They're everywhere, but it's important to kind of acknowledge that is like a trend that appears within the literature, and to kind of explore why that's the case, how and why London is part of that story sometimes, in some cases. And I think it was also very interesting what you said about the bounds in terms of, do we just look at published literature, but then that can be quite narrow, and where the kind of bounds of the project lie. I think I've decided to go for things only published in this century, just to sort of narrow it down a little. There was some stuff before, but it's the project needs its parameters. And in terms of kind of self-published online work, I am conscious of some self-published online work, but I think that becomes very, very difficult to track, both the self-published online stuff and the corpus of, like I said, kind of 40 to 50 physical books. Certainly I'd be very interested to kind of in the future look into a project around self-published work, because I do think that's a really important kind of element of British Latinx writing. But within this project, I think I am kind of choosing to focus on stuff that has been kind of published, even if that's through small independent publishers or self-publishing.
Isobel, can you allow me to interrupt you? Sorry. Just want to open the floor to the question and answer from question and answer sessions. If any of the attendees have any question, please choose the raise hand options at the top of the windows, the tab in front of your screens. Any questions, any comments you want to make? All right. Okay. If you want to continue responding, you can continue respond. Or if you don't, then I will I would like to conclude the session.
Yeah, let's
Great.
conclude. Yeah.
All right, in that case, thank you very much, Isobel. Like I said, it was very engaging and interdisciplinary. I mean, I could see the second part is directly related to the law and the politics, people from the law and politics background. And I think it's the similar issues, the big picture, which I can see, is applicable in many other countries. For example, if you try to relate issues in the revival of Hebrew in Israel, federal countries like South Asian countries, or I already mentioned the Canadian context, the big picture is also applicable there. But yes, Dr. Ryan, thank you very much for the useful feedback. Sebastian, for the comments and the question you raised. I'm pretty sure that Isobel has found it very useful. Same time next week, let's meet our next guest speaker, Arbaz Muzaffar, PhD candidate, School of Law, University of Birmingham, will present the project titled Evaluating Demographic Engineering and Forced Integration Within International Law, Kashmir and Palestine's Parallel Narratives on 23rd of October at same time, 3 to 4. Until then, look after yourself. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thanks. Bye-bye.